Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest edition from Compeer's series of webinars. And so today, the focal point of the discussions will be outsourcing and how it is utilised and also making the most of it in the wealth management industry. I must start by thanking each of our sponsors for their continued support in the running of these webinars. And I'm also very pleased today to be joined by our guest speakers, which includes both providers to the industry as well as senior professionals from the wealth management firms to share their first-hand experiences of outsourcing. And later, I'll then provide some performance comparisons from our benchmarking survey. So I'll be looking at in-house against outsourcing firms. And then to finish, we have a webinar, we have a wealth management panel session to answer any of your questions. So although we're not going to have time to have a Q&A session after each individual presentation, I'd still like to point out there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please do use it throughout the webinar to pose any questions that I'll then use for the panel session later. If there are any questions I'm unable to get answered, I'll make sure they are addressed after the webinar. But without further ado, let's get cracking with the presentations. So our first guest speaker today is Jason Naby from Luxoft, with his presentation, Making a Success of Outsourcing to Gain Business Agility and Operational Leverage. Welcome, Jason, and over to you.
Thanks, James. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. It's a big topic and a big title for what I think is about 8 to 10 minutes. So I won't do it justice, but I'll try and cover some of what perhaps might be the key points. If we can go through to the next slide. Thank you. So I think the big thing with outsourcing, and just as a bit of background and a quick introduction, I've had the experience or the benefit of over 20 years working for some of the largest providers to the wealth management and the asset management industry in outsourcing and delivery of outsourcing services, and have, most of that time spent my time building outsourcing capabilities to the likes of HSBC, BNP Paribas, SocGen, Bank of New York. But I've also been very much involved in the wealth tech space and how the fintech space or the wealth tech space is helping reshape and develop the outsourcing opportunities across the marketplace. But I think it's important in any discussion around outsourcing to consider, frankly, the attitudes to outsourcing, or what's happening in the industry that's shaping the take-up of outsourcing. And specifically in wealth, it's at quite an interesting crossroads. Certainly as we deal with the implications and the impact of COVID, remote working, remote relationship management, and how that's changing the dialogue with the CEOs and the COOs of wealth managers, private banks, family offices, in the context of how they operate today, how they provide access and support and applications to their employees, to their front office, to their bankers and relationship managers, and how do they continue to undertake regulated activities in multiple jurisdictions, albeit in a new way of working, in a new context of working. So this is an evolving and changing landscape. But the attitudes and the take-up of outsourcing in wealth are something similar to, right now, or something similar to I experienced and was part of just after the global financial crisis of 2008. And what happened back then as a consequence of the GFC, specifically in capital markets or investment banking and in asset management, was a surge in outsourcing or take-up of outsourcing as a consequence of that catalyst for change, of that, the drivers coming together in a particular way that reshaped the attitude and the appetite for outsourcing. And I think one thing, and you can see what's on the screen in front of you, but one thing to consider, obviously, sort of goes without saying, is there are many different flavors to outsourcing, whether it be ITO, so the pure tech outsourcing, whether it be BPO, so the business processing outsourcing. Predominantly that sits in the back office functions, or a lot of the back office functions. But there are also niche and specialist providers out there that offer OCIO, so outsource chief investment officer or DFM capabilities. And there are firms out there providing dealing services more and more on an outsourced basis to the wealth markets in particular. So there's a growing range of choice or growing specialization, so to speak, in regards to outsourcing services. And I think all of that helps in regards to the adoption and the adaptation of the businesses and the business models and the operating models of wealth managers and private banks. And in this context, I think the dialogue with the CEOs, the COOs, the CTOs that I speak to week in, week out has changed, is beginning to shift. And we now, I think, at the beginning of a wave of outsourcing across the wealth management and the private banking sector that up until now has been slightly held off or put back. If we go to the next slide. Again, to give some further context to this, and this was something that was being talked about and discussed across the industry pre-COVID, pre-crisis, is this context of the today, the tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and what is beginning to influence and reshape these businesses, and how wealth managers, private banks are looking to develop, to adapt their operating model, their business models, as a consequence of some of the things that are beginning to influence or disrupt their businesses in the way it currently performed. And if you look at the today, which is the last couple of years, and indeed perhaps the next couple of years, digital client experiences and digital wealth management and robo has been up and coming through the industry with some obvious examples. But that transition is still very much taking place. It's still, and a lot of firms have a bit of a mixed set of capabilities when it comes to digital. I today still get my quarterly statements or my annual statements in paper form through the post, which is bonkers and somewhat strange to consider the role I'm in. But a lot of the firms that I'm partnering with, working with, look more and more to that digital experience, that client experience, and perfecting the client experience in some form or another. So digital and the digital client experience being very much a here and now priority. But what is really fundamentally shaping up as the game changer, and it kind of ties to the quote below, is the adoption of cloud-based strategies when it comes to infrastructure and application frameworks, and how cloud can enable a number of levers when it comes to either servicing or service capability or capacity to service, and frankly provide a degree of business agility that's up until now has been really hard to achieve or almost impossible to achieve with an on-prem operational or IT strategy. And again, this is beginning to feed through to perhaps the day after tomorrow in the context of 5 to 10 years from now. And again, if you think in the context of the industry as is, and a lot of traditions, a lot of firms operating in classic standardized operating ways with a lot of face time and limitations in regards to how they scale the business. And yet we're seeing more disruption coming through with brand new entrants, with digital entrants coming in and arguably reshaping or challenging the status quo. And that is already beginning to be felt. And, there's already a lot of focus across the industry in regards to the total cost of ownership or the cost income ratios of these businesses and how they operate, and how do they start to compete or being able to compete with these digital new entrants. So this is a real moment of change, a real moment of redefining things in the context of how these businesses operate. Perhaps the next slide. I always like to refer to this, which is a fascinating observation in the context of what's already happened in other industries and how change happens pretty slow, but that's to start with, but then pretty rapid and almost all of a sudden with the consequences becoming fairly dire for those that lag behind innovation or transformation in some form or another. And if we go to the next slide, this is already beginning to be felt or observed in some way, shape, or form within the wealth space. And we're seeing rapid growth through some of these digital new entrants as traditional firms or firms with traditional models and with limitations in terms of their operating capability or their technology, struggling to keep the pace, to stay with the pace of change, and frankly, struggling to adapt and to adopt new means and new ways. So again, I think this is already beginning to happen, and this has already started to feed through the wealth segments in some obvious forms and some obvious shapes. If we go through to the next slide, we can directly translate, where are some of the pain points across the typical wealth manager, private bank organization, and looking at the classic structure and how these businesses have been evolving and that they've been built and maintained over the last 20 or 30 years. A lot of this infrastructure, a lot of these functions, a lot of these operations all sit in-house today for many, many firms within the industry. So this isn't a market that's naturally evolved to outsourcing. It is some way and shape behind, as I said previously, the asset management sector or indeed the investment banking sector when it comes to adoption of outsourcing and third-party services. But nevertheless, we're already beginning to identify and see where there are some obvious pain points and opportunities for transformation, for digitization, for outsourcing of capabilities. And again, I think this is beginning to shape the dialogue and the various engagements that firms like the one I work for have with CTOs and COOs when it comes to developing strategic roadmaps for these businesses at an operational and an infrastructure level. And how do we start to transform the industry from a mostly in-house, on-prem setup as is in the past or as is today into one that's much more agile, cloud-based, with a range of applications that fit and serve all of the challenge, and solve for many of the challenges that they look to develop their businesses through. So things like making their front office more productive, things like making their front offices more compliant, or putting some control or structure in place so they can channel resources into particular parts of their business. And again, I think this is reshaping the business in parts, and already many firms are questioning whether or not they should be manufacturing products in-house or whether or not they should be adopting third-party service providers. Many firms are looking to move away from in-house investment operations and in-house core banking infrastructures or functions to go to third-party providers that can operate business process outsourcing or core banking as a service, platform as a service type offerings on behalf of these institutions, so they can focus more of their time, more of their resources into developing that middle and that front office and that client experience. But again, even with those middle office and those front office functions, looking to move away from in-house application frameworks to application frameworks that are supported through things like a SaaS delivery capability or a cloud-based delivery capability, and have much more integration and much more capability so they can deliver functionality and service not only to the front office but ultimately to the end clients. And as we all know in this industry, it's not easy. Many of these firms are looking to manage relationships from mass affluence up to high net worth and sometimes beyond. And again, the levels of service, the functional requirements of those different types of clients can be very different. So we're seeing opportunities to automate at the lower end of the market, to provide more self-service capabilities as part of that client experience for the mass affluence, and create much more of a hybrid, integrated, connected set of capabilities across the front office and the higher value clients. And again, all of this is beginning to take shape in the context of the overall transformation and the overall remodeling of the business. If we go to the next slide, then I'm probably going to start to wrap up. In the context of putting together a strategy, so to speak, for outsourcing, I think every discussion we have or I have with COOs and CTOs, it starts with fundamentally what they're good at or what they're great at. and what aren't they not so good at, and what really shouldn't be part of their focus or part of their energy. And thinking about those core competencies in a slightly new way, and then looking to collaborate, to partner, to leverage, and to create opportunities for improving scale, improving capacity, improving service offering through sourcing of the right partners, and then developing the plan with those partners and creating a roadmap to the future, or to that day after tomorrow state, with the added advantages of the business agility it brings. And again, we're seeing lots of firms that up until now have made various decisions based upon some of their operational, some of their technology, some of their location limitations. And when it comes to things like opening new centers, extending new capabilities, servicing new clients, some of the challenges that go with the legacy infrastructure are really holding these businesses back. So it's how to transform these businesses into more agile, service-based operations that can deliver and support growth. And again, growth, it can be through, we've seen plenty of firms that have been on the M&A agenda and focusing on bringing in new businesses or opening new booking centers. And it's about how to support new locations or new capabilities or extensions of business at the right price point in the right time. And again, I think that focus on agility and development of business agility is a key part of any outsourcing strategy. And as I said earlier, I think the fundamentals that go with that in terms of adoption of cloud and development of a cloud strategy and bringing together applications in a more connected, more holistic way to support a new dynamic, a new paradigm in terms of the way these firms operate today and how they will operate in the future is all part of what should go into the outsource strategy and the selection of outsource partners. So hopefully that wasn't too much of an advert in terms of Luxoft, but gives you some context in terms of some of the things we're hearing or seeing and some of the approaches that we're helping clients develop when it comes to development of more agile operating states, more and selection of outsourced providers and development of an outsourcing strategy. Back to James.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. And now we're going to move on to something a little different. So I'm pleased to welcome Anita Janeja from SEI and Alex Twist from Connor Broadley. And they're going to be discussing the experiences of Connor Broadley when recently going live on the SEI platform. So over to you, Anita and Alex.
Thanks, James. So, hi, for those of you who don't know me, as James said, I work for SEI and I'm responsible for the relationship management and client service teams for the SEI Wealth platform. As James said, we are joined by Alex Twist, an investment manager for the UK wealth manager, Connor Broadley. Jason has clearly articulated the challenges of outsourcing and the pain points, so that's actually a really nice lead-in for Alex and myself. So we'd like to thank Compeer for the opportunity, so you can all hear from Alex about Connor Broadley's experience of implementing a new outsource provider within the current pandemic environment. I'd just like to give you a little bit of background on Alex, because I think it's quite pertinent to the process that we actually went through. So as well as being an investment manager, Alex sits on various investment and strategy committees at Connor Broadley. He also instigated and developed Connor Broadley's progressive offering, which is a range of 5 multi-asset socially responsible portfolios. So, you know, there's a reason for me almost giving him that background in terms of the investment manager. And then in 2019, as well as carrying on with his investment management responsibilities, he was tasked with selecting a new platform provider, given his breadth and depth of experience, not only in investment management, but also operations. So really the ground up at Connor Broadley. So that was quite key in terms of how they were working through their RFP process. At the end of 2019, Connor Broadley selected SEI as their partner of choice. And then so I think selecting a partner is one thing, but then the real work comes when you go into implementation. So early in 2020, SCI and Connor Broadley embarked on the implementation process. And Alex, again, given his experience, as well as carrying out his investment manager responsibilities, yet again, carried out the role of program manager for Connor Broadley as part of that implementation. Now, we all know what happened in March of 2020. So in the midst of kicking off the implementation, the pandemic hit. So that meant that both SCI and Connor Broadley had to quite swiftly manage the implementation remotely. So our focus very much here won't be the challenges that someone has when they're choosing an outsource provider or within their business. Alex and his team had already done that. So now we're going to focus on some questions around actually implementing remotely and how we both went about that. So Alex, thanks for joining as part of this. I know that we're both quite excited to be here. So I'm going to hand over to you. And my first question, selfishly, is going to be why you selected SCI.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I think to answer your first question, really a lot of the things that Jason, the previous speaker, was talking to are very much the concerns that are at the heart of businesses like ours. You know, we are at a key staging post in the development of our business and recognize that choosing the correct tools, the correct outsourcing provider is vital for allowing us to focus on the areas that we add value and giving over the areas that we don't have any particular expertise or depth of resource to deliver to another party. And from our perspective, that has been really key in the SCI choice, because we felt that what we were doing was choosing a very large, well-established, very well-resourced provider. But I think from our perspective, what was so exciting was that this was a provider that had really thought long and hard about what the most pleasant user experience would be, the best way to automate so much of the stuff in our day-to-day that isn't necessarily added value, and allow us as investment managers to focus much more closely on the things that we do well, which is investment management, investment selection, asset allocation. So it was a very interesting period because, you know, big change for us, the largest single project that we've undertaken as a business, and to come into the first quarter of 2020 and really to kick off that process, you know, the things we were looking for, we were very pleased to have found. So one of the things I know that anyone else doing a big project like this will obviously go through is recognizing and trying to understand which of the offerings aren't just about a good sales pitch, but which are the offerings that have the most depth to them as well in terms of delivering on all the things that they promise. So for us, SCI was that, and when lockdown occurred, we were so pleased we'd chosen that because the depth of resource became even more important. The focus and adherence of robust, well-tested processes on this onboarding process was really important. And in the nice third thing was that the quality and caliber of people were very helpful as well as very proficient. So there was a warmth in all the things that SCI did when they were helping us through this process. I think my final comment would be that when you're making a decision like this is, 10 years, 20 years plus in terms of our business. It's a costly exercise. You need to get it right. And I completely agree with Jason, which is that if you're going to make a decision like this, you need to focus on those providers that aren't the safe hands of the past necessarily, but the ones that are going to be the most cutting edge going forward. And that was a big reason for choosing SCI, building their own portfolio management system from the ground up at huge expense, placed it far and above ahead of some of the peers that we'd seen who had essentially bought things off the shelf and tried to integrate them, and there was always that slight lack of functionality or slight lack of integration. Sorry, slightly rambling answer, but I hope that's covered off some of those key points.
No, that's really helpful, and I think, like you said, it certainly does go back to and ring true in terms of what Jason talked about as well, which I think is a real positive. I think there you've definitely touched on some of the experience of implementing the SEI Wealth platform whilst both our teams were working remotely. I think the industry as a whole has had to handle that. Could you identify perhaps the single biggest reason why you believe the implementation was delivered on time and budget despite us being in a lockdown situation?
So I think really it is to do with planning, and that probably encapsulates one or two underlying aspects. I mean, the first is that there was clearly a very capable depth of resource behind everything that SEI did. So we had very experienced project managers. So when we were forced to work remotely, that wasn't a problem. They were professional enough, capable enough that we didn't notice much of a difference. Face-to-face meetings were just replaced with Zoom meetings, which become the norm. All of the document transfers and debugging that occurred across the process was done all through a secure SFTP, which was really easy to use and something that SEI had in place long before COVID. And I think that's the key thing. These were, disaster recovery for a lot of firms, particularly those which are smaller, is an exercise you sort of try and tick off. We felt very much as we got through those lockdown days that this was something that really mattered and had been robustly tested, and the resource around it was impressive. So we were kept on task. The project managers were very good at making sure that we hit all of our deadlines as well, and were very helpful when we had queries on issues. They were very prepared to hop on calls with us at a moment's notice to give us an indication of where we could go to fix certain issues. So it was just that planning that had been done in the days prior to COVID that really showed itself up during the COVID lockdown period.
So outside of the planning, do you think there's any particular lessons that you yourself have taken from this experience that you feel have been invaluable?
Yes, I think one of the slightly more interesting side effects is that you end up getting to become very close to the people you're doing this project with, and I think you want to be trying to foster an environment where us as the client and SEI as the vendor are feeling very much as if we're one team pulling towards the same mutual goal, which is that success for one is also success for the other. And that's very much what we felt during the process. And it made a big difference. It meant that, we felt that we could go the extra mile and try and do something to help make something more clear to members of the SEI team. And SEI were very happy to come and give us as much detail and support as we needed, and try to understand, not just from a sort of static list of requirements, but as this is how they will actively use the system. This is how they've used it before. So I think that's crucial, working together as a team on both sides. And from one thing I would say to other potential clients of other custodians like SEI is you really, 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 really want to be trying to adopt rather than trying to adapt. It's very easy for people to get used to their own processes and the way they've done things historically, but just as the technology is changing, our business processes are needing to be changed, needing to be updated. So whether that be from, moving to digitization, which is one of the key things that the SEI portal has allowed us to do, to have really handy, really easy to use document storage for our clients that's accessible automatically, all the way through to, the day-to-day operation of the investment team. We want to change our processes that we make the best use of these tools, which have been incredibly well thought out, very well tested, and equally, people have put much more development money into that solution than we could ever as a smaller business.
That's really helpful, and I think, Alex, I would echo some of the comments you talked about in terms of the lessons. So I think we went from a client vendor to a true partnership where we were collaborating well. So as much as SEI kept kind of broadly to task, we certainly were kept to task by you, and I think that really did come out, and that's a key tenet of the SEI Wealth platform in terms of its partnership and its collaboration. So we'd like to, Alex and I, and on behalf of Alex and I, would like to thank you all for listening. We do hope you found that insightful. Obviously, if there's any questions that you would like to pose, please do feel free to come to Alex and myself through the Q&A system. And I'll now hand back to James. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anita and Alex. So that brings us nicely onto my own presentation. So as mentioned before, over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll be taking you through some of the performance comparisons between a group of wealth management firms that outsource, and that's outsourced in some way, versus other wealth management firms that have chosen to keep all of their processes in-house. So if we could please move on to my first slide. Okay, so here are some of the key areas in which wealth managers can choose to outsource. So the two most common areas that they do outsource currently are operations, such as settlement and custody, and IT services, and these being the areas where there is actually the greatest choice of suppliers to the wealth industry. And therefore, operations and IT will be key themes that I'll focus on throughout my presentation. Then we've got outsourced fund management services. Well, unsurprisingly, it's less commonly used by wealth managers, as often there's a firm's unique side of things is their management skills and their expertise, and it's a key reason why clients choose to use them in the first place. Then we have marketing, and so this is an area that the wealth management industry is known to be behind the curve of others in financial services, and for example, others in the provision of luxury goods. And with some firms having very limited in-house marketing resources, as they rely heavily on word-of-mouth referrals for new business, accessing the marketing expertise of an outsourcing provider is something they could consider. And then we have compliance and regulation. So releasing the burden on wealth management firms and therefore keeping up with the tsunami of regulations each year is often a key selling point for the outsourcing provider. And this will often be utilised and also be an expectation of those that outsource operations and IT. For example, the service provided having to be fully compliant. However, with wealth managers, they'll often still maintain an in-house compliance team to ensure that all of the processes are monitored carefully and therefore to prevent any sizable fines from the regulator. Therefore, it's actually quite rare to see that compliance being fully outsourced. And finally, we have corporate services. So this is such as the likes of finance and HR. And these tend to be used when a firm has decided to outsource the majority of its back office. So let's now see what the uptake is from the industry. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Well, the answer, as Jason mentioned earlier, is that currently there's been very little uptake at all in terms of outsourcing services in the wealth industry. So this chart shows the total outsourcing costs among wealth managers. And so that's a combination of all of the services I outlined in the previous slide, and then taken this as a proportion of total costs. And the figures show that consistently in and around about 3% is spent on outsourcing. So for example, in 2019, wealth managers spent a total of 5.06 billion, and of this, just 173 million related to outsourced costs, so 3.41%. But the issue that outsourcing providers often have is that the majority of firms are very well established and are therefore set in their ways, and therefore take a major change and in some cases an expense for these firms if they were to embrace a new outsourcing model. And these major changes are few and far between, and so firms need to see a distinct advantage to outsourcing with a fast payback if they are to even consider going down this route. But on a more positive note for the outsourcing providers, and from speaking with firms, the consensus was that if they were to start a wealth management firm today and start from scratch, the majority would in fact outsource. Therefore, new startups could be a key target market. Also, as many mentioned, the pandemic has already been acted as a catalyst for firms to become innovative and to embrace digital services. So could it therefore be the point in time for firms to act now and to consider using these outsourcing providers? If we could move to the next slide, please. So let's take a look at some of the comparisons between those firms that are already outsourcing and those that are fully in-house. And my focus is going to be on wealth managers. And to start with, I've got some weighted averages here, looking at the growth for these firms between 2015 and 2019. So for the assets, the growth values are the weighted average comparing 31st December 2019 to 31st December 2015, whilst for the revenue, it's a percentage growth for the calendar years. And the first thing to note is that this was a period of good growth for the industry as a whole, even with a slight downturn in 2018. But even so, the results are very encouraging to start with for the outsourcing firms, as their growth has outpaced the in-house firms for both assets and revenues. And I mentioned that these are weighted averages, and in the case of the outsourcing firms, it's the larger firms within that group who have been among the fastest growing, achieving growth in excess of 70% for assets, for example, and therefore they've driven up the performance of the group as a whole. And some may therefore argue that median values may be a better representation. And with these, it does bring the values closer, but outsourcing remains on top. So just about for in terms of asset growth, so it's 44% against 43% for the in-house firms. But the gap remains there for revenues, where you've got 37% growth for the outsourcing firms against 26% for in-house. So I'm not saying that the direct cause for this additional growth is because the firms are outsourcing, but it's more to say that, because there will be plenty of other factors that impact growth, it's more to say that these results suggest that outsourcing can support growth and therefore assist with firms achieving scale. On to the next slide, please. So now we're going to take a little look at the productivity of the front office within these firms. And although firms do not typically outsource the front office, by outsourcing back office functions, it could actually improve their efficiency, whilst giving firms access to a wider range of resources, such as in the digital space, that will support the front office and therefore improve productivity. And now, as it stands, there's not too much separating the productivity in the front office between the two firm groups. For example, when you look at the managed assets per FOP and the managed revenue per FOP. But interestingly, the key difference is in terms of the number of managed portfolios per front office professional, and with the outsourcing firms higher at 202 versus 142. And the average size of these portfolios happens to be smaller, which is why actually the in-house firms have a marginally higher level of assets per FOP. However, with a smaller average portfolio value, the return on these assets is often higher. And so for the key ratio of revenue per front office professional, the outsourcing firms again have the edge. And it therefore appears that outsourcing can allow for the front office staff to take on more clients, which will then drive future revenue growth. And I also believe this is one stat where there's a potential for the outsourcing firms to start to pull away from those that remain fully in-house. That's provided that the outsourcing suppliers capitalize on their resources and continue to develop their services to be leading edge. On to the next slide, please. Cost is clearly going to be a factor whether or not to outsource. And as these are the two main departments that firms outsource, I thought that operations and IT seem to be the natural place to look. And what I've done here is take a look at the total IT and operations costs and taken them as a percentage of revenue and also on a per £1 million of assets basis. And I must stress that these are total costs, and so it's not just the cost of outsourcing. So they'll also include any in-house staff costs in each of the departments, as well as non-staff costs such as information services or IT hardware and systems, and any operational non-staff costs as well. And as it stands, it looks like the costs are higher among those firms that outsource. For example, there is a 6% difference in the weighted averages for the IT and operations costs as a percentage of revenue, although the median values are actually very, very similar. Whereas on a per £1 million of assets basis, we've got a £600 difference in favour of the firms that remain in-house. But I believe that the costs for the outsourcing firms could be significantly lower than they currently are. And it's not that outsourcing is necessarily expensive, but it's more so that not all of the firms are fully capitalising on the benefits of outsourcing, which is therefore driving up their costs. And this is going to be shown on my next slide. If we could please move on to it. So here we have the total number of in-house IT and operations staff per £1 billion of assets for each of the firm groups. And the remarkable result is that as you can see, for the outsourcing and the in-house groups, the values are almost identical. And surely one would expect that for firms that outsource, there would be far fewer in-house staff members in these departments. But yet this is not the case. And in fact, many of those that outsource have failed to reap a key benefit of outsourcing and have maintained an in-house team that would be sufficiently large to run all of the processes in-house. This therefore builds up a sizable cost and one that we'd hope could be avoided. And I appreciate that there will be some in-house staff that will be required in each of these departments to for example, monitor the systems and maintain the relationship with the outsourcing provider. And also there's going to be significant HR issues, and so it's not possible to simply reduce these teams instantly overnight. However, given some of these firms have been outsourcing for many years now, there should have been time to reduce the size of these teams to improve the margins of the firms. And that's why costs of some of the outsourcing firms are higher, and as they're essentially running both an outsourcing project whilst also paying for a similar sized in-house team. On to the next slide, please. So clearly that's going to have an impact on margins. And here we've got the weighted average pre-tax profit margins for each of the groups of firms over a 5-year period between 2015 and 2019. And what's formed is a noticeable gap between the in-house firms and those that outsource, which was as wide as 12.8% in 2018. And this gap may have closed in 2019 to 8.1%, but it's still some way to go for the outsourcing firms. And in the case of these firms, it's among the larger firms in the category that have been the worst in terms of cost control, and therefore have maintained large in-house teams. Therefore, they've driven down the margins of the group as a whole. So if we were to look at the median pre-tax profit margins, the impact of these firms becomes less severe. And if we can move on to the next slide. And here are those medians. So although the margins for in-house firms remain higher, the gap in the most recent year is down to just 3.8%. And you may have also noticed that 2018 was somewhat of an anomaly, where the skewing from the larger firms was at its most severe. So actually, when you look at the median margins for this year, there was very little difference between in-house and outsourcing firms. But one thing is for sure is that there's plenty of room for improvement in terms of these margins among all of the wealth managers, but particularly those that are currently outsourcing. On to the next slide, please. And so to finish my presentation, I just wanted to take a look at scalability and how it is potentially supported by outsourcing. Now, scalability is one of the major issues we've seen in wealth management in general, with costs rising at a similar rate or even quicker than revenues. Therefore, although the industry is in a growth phase, and it has been for many years, margins actually remain very flat or even are reducing for a large number of firms. Therefore, by definition, these firms are not scalable. And our definition of being scalable over a given period is that the firm must be profitable, it must have achieved revenue growth, and at the same time must have seen an improvement in their pre-tax profit margin. And so first we look at the most recent year, so that's comparing 2019 to 2018. And in this period, we have 36% of firms that outsource achieved a scalable result, whereas in contrast, the in-house firms figure was slightly lower at 31%. And if we then widen the horizon to look at 2019 versus 2015, the results are more positive. And so we've got the outsourcing group rising to 50% of them being scalable, which is 13% higher than the in-house group. Now, these are still lower than I'm sure the industry would like to see, but it does imply that if more firms were to outsource, it could be one of the factors that allows the industry as a whole to deliver more scalable results. Well, that's provided that the firms embrace it and do not maintain the large in-house teams. For example, the firms that failed to do this were the majority of those that are classed as non-scalable within the outsourcing group. Well, that concludes my presentation. And so we're now going to move on to the final stage of our webinar, which is the Wealth Management panel session. So please may I remind you that if you do wish to pose any questions, please use the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen, and I'll look to get as many of these answered as possible. But for our panel session, I'm delighted to welcome 3 guests. We have David Joyce from CreaLogix, Achana Mohan from Veritas Investment Management, and Mark Harrison, a consultant with extensive experience in wealth management. So welcome all, and if we could please start with a brief introduction to yourselves. So let's start with you, David.
Thank you, James. Yes, I'm David Joyce. I'm the CEO for CreaLogix here in the UK. We're a software development business specialising in wealth management and specialising in the system of engagement. So very much focused on the front of office and integrating into the middle and back office side of things.
Thank you, David. And Archana?
Hi, everyone. I'm Archana. I work for Veritas Investment Management. We are an independent wealth manager based in London, and I run operations and technology for the firm. And we are one of those wealth managers who outsources all of our non-core services. So this is a really interesting discussion, and I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you. And finally, Mark.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mark Harrison, career in financial services, both line management and as a consultant, all on the buy side. The last 20 years, I've really specialized in outsourcing, both from within the service provider community and in terms of being a buyer of it as well. Started in, I guess, the big end of town, institutional fund management, spent 15 years with BNP Paribas. Recently moved my focus to wealth management, which is fascinating, and as many speakers have said, ripe for change, and the outsourcing opportunities in this sector are very interesting.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'll get cracking with the questions. And let's actually start with you, Mark, as you're on the screen. So what would you class as the main positives to arise from outsourcing? So quite a broad question to start.
It is. You know, a lot of the speakers have covered that. I'm just going to mention a couple of things that haven't been mentioned. One is risk. Now, you can take all sorts of views of risk, and outsourcing transfers your risk. You move kind of internal operational risk to a third party, and that's a different game. But you can argue that you're reducing a number of your risks. And in a world where a number of us are obsessed with client money in particular, cash activity, not cash responsibility, but cash activity is something that you can think about passing to your outsourcers. That's a big tick. The other one is, and this is an interesting one as well, is deployment of capital. Anyone on the call who's involved in setting up ICAPs and reviewing ICAPs, and depending how you're doing your accounting, you arguably need to allocate less capital if you've got an outsourcing proposition, because you're moving from an internal fixed cost to an external variable cost. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts there that are slightly different to the main sort of mainstream of the benefits. That last one free to any service providers who are listening.
Thank you, Mark. And how about you, Archana, as you're experiencing it today very much firsthand?
So I would agree with everything that everyone said. That's becoming a common theme in on this panel. But I think the one I would add would be simplicity. Theoretically, outsourcing should afford firms the opportunity to become simpler. That's the sort of nirvana state, I would say. So that would be, for me, one of the main positives of outsourcing. Now, probably it's safe to say that doesn't happen overnight. It takes a little bit of work and a lot of engagement, but it is possible. And as a result of that simplicity, you end up with all of the positives that you've already touched on, including cost benefits, scalability, productivity, and flexibility.
Thank you. And David, coming from the supplier side of things, what do you believe to be the most main positives to arise from outsourcing?
Well, I won't buck the trend in terms of probably agreeing with everything that's gone before, but I think it's inarguable that firms just can't go it alone anymore. The pace of change, the breadth of offering means that doing it alone just becomes a massively expensive business. I think one of the things that perhaps maybe to turn the question back around is, I suppose firms could ask themselves, what's the benefit of automatically doing everything in-house themselves? I think, one of the other things to consider is, I think the term out in outsourcing isn't particularly helpful. I think it should just be called sourcing. And really what firms should be looking to do is to really scan the broad range of offerings and suppliers that are out there, and look to exploit the best of class and best in breed in order to enhance their own unique value. I think, in terms of the main positives, is that there is a vast array of options out there. Go exploit it.
So, David, you mentioned that there is a vast array of options. So, do you believe there's enough that actually specifically specialise in wealth management and therefore can support a wide spectrum of the technology needs of these firms?
Well, as a supplier provider, regrettably, I'd say yes, there are. We track around 150 providers and suppliers in this space, and that's just us and our view. And so I don't think there's any shortage of suppliers. I think what it means, though, for firms is increasingly, as you get this broad range of suppliers who are doing very specific tasks and solving specific problems, the ability of firms to be able to articulate what it is or what problem they're trying to solve, and therefore which particular group of suppliers or type of supplier they need, becomes more sophisticated. So yeah, I think there's plenty. There's plenty of choice out there. It's really about how you articulate and navigate what's out there.
Okay. If we move on, now, this question will be start with Mark for this one. So, Bryn asked, do our panel members believe that an outsourced solution can deliver cost-effective, flexible processes to cater for the desires of bespoke discretionary fund managers? So, Mark, what are your views on that? I think you may need to unmute yourself.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the back end processes of bespoke discretionary fund management, I mean those are the same for any kind of outsourcing and portfolio management. If you look at the tech that supports portfolio management and all the settlement and administration processes behind it, absolutely so. I think where outsourcing often struggles and gets into difficulty is when it interacts with the client service proposition and the client experience. And bespoke DFM, certainly above a certain size, almost always goes with a high care level for the client. And a lot of outsourced propositions, they're not quite one size fits all, but you're very much expected to fit into a standard sort of pattern of client service, be that client reporting, client engagement, however you want to play it. So I think that's the place where you have to look at it carefully. But absolutely, I don't think bespoke DFM is different to anything else. One other point, and Jason was kind of talking about this as well, the actual process of investment management and decision making around DFM is increasingly something that can be outsourced as well.
Thank you. And Arsha, would you agree that you can have a fully bespoke service and still realise the benefits of outsourcing, or do you feel it does need to become more standardised?
So I would agree that you can outsource, but I think there's a really interesting sub-question in there, which is, do each of us know what we're really good at, which I think has come up before. I think it might have been in one of the prior presentations, but basically, I believe that it is our responsibility to each of our clients to really understand where our core competencies lie and to really make those core competencies better by partnering with the right firms. So we can't be all things to all people, or maybe we can, and I just haven't cracked that code. But I believe that if you figure out what you really want to do and which part of the market you really want to serve, and then partner with those firms that are best suited to deliver the solutions to the problems you're facing on the back end, you probably have a really nice partnership there.
Great. And staying with you, Archana, there isn't a huge amount of uptake currently in terms of outsourcing in wealth management. So what do you think the current providers could do better, or how could they improve their service to tempt more firms to outsource, therefore supporting their technological development along the way?
So I think you covered it, James, in your presentation when you said it's difficult to start from where you are and rip parts of your offering up to get something different, right? It's always easy to start with a blank sheet of paper, but it's a lot harder to start from a spaghetti junction, which is how I would describe current financial services in terms of their technology and operational suite of kind of support networks. So I'm not sure this is all down to the outsource provider's responsibility. I think there's a joint responsibility here. First, you need to assess what are the most urgent pain points that you want to solve for, and then work out who can deliver you help with those. Now, whether that's a broad brush, wide, sort of a consultancy type relationship where you assess each of those areas and then try to solve for them, or whether that's just dealing with one thing at a time. I think there's a combination of communication, a high degree of training, and a real understanding on the part of the outsourced service provider of what your business model really means. And I think I can't underemphasize that enough. I think oftentimes we as wealth managers get sold things that are perhaps, they sound really good on paper, but when you actually slot them into the business, they perhaps don't solve for the thing you were trying to solve for in the first place. So I think there needs to be a common understanding that's built of what you're trying to achieve. I hope that answers the question. Sorry, long-winded.
Yeah, that's great. And Mark, would you have anything to add in terms of the improvements that you'd like to see from the outsourcing providers? And Archana mentioned about more training. So would you feel that that is certainly an area they could improve?
I'd make a couple of points. One is exactly what Archana said, which is having a dialogue with their clients about what really matters to the business. And that's not my reconciliations are slow or this costs too much. I mean, those things are really important. But if you're running a wealth management business, those are not necessarily top of mind. They're rather hygiene factors. And so many business process outsourcers don't turn up with the ability to engage in that sort of narrative. So it tends to be pushed too far down the value chain. That's the first point I'd make. And the other point I'd make is that at the moment, looking at the UK, I don't think that the providers have got sufficient scale. And I'm not talking about IT providers here, of which there are many, as David was saying. I'm talking about serious, heavy-duty providers who can run your back office and start to do it at scale. And when you're looking to outsource operations, and I was talking about some client money and so on, you do want a large organization that's got strength in depth, industrial strength that's sitting there. So that's quite hard to deal with, get bigger, but I think we could do with some bigger players.
Thank you, Mark. And David, now, as a natural supplier, what improvements do you think you could make?
I think one of the things that we are doing more is trying to work with firms and with prospective clients to really identify, and I think it largely plays to some of the things that Mark and Archana have said, is we have clients or potential clients that come to us and say, "Oh, we want a portal." And it's like, okay, but what problem are you trying to solve? Back to these pain points. What are the? We have a phrase within our business about what are the jobs to be done, because I think there is an absence and there is a need for stronger kind of consulting, especially from a digital transformation perspective, that really sorts out what it is you're hoping to the problem that you're trying to solve, the cost you're trying to take out, the improvement that you're trying to make to customer service. And then let's talk about the solution. And I think all too often it's very tempting to just reach for the solution. Now, as a software product provider, that's the business that we're in. But I think we are responsible and and need to take a responsible view with our clients and potential clients in terms of, before you start thinking about writing checks, are you really clear about what it is you're trying to achieve? Because otherwise everybody will be disappointed.
Okay, well, just looking at the time, I'll make this the last question now. So it's asking, do you believe that firms need to widen their budgets if they are to embrace more in terms of outsourcing? And when starting an outsourcing agreement, after what period would you expect to see positive results? So let's start with Mark on this one.
A couple of points. First off, you don't necessarily outsource to save money. Obviously, it helps, and it helps with the business case. But there's all sorts of other drivers there. You might be facilitating growth, you might be enabling digital or whatever. So it's not always just about saving money. If it's large scale IT and business process outsourcing, as Alex was saying earlier, it probably is a 5 or 10 year journey, and you need to be looking at the financial investment over that kind of period. So it's not just about paying money. The other big aspect of it is the actual implementation is a risky and often costly. So the project work to put something in place in itself needs to be factored into the business case you're running. But in terms of benefits, and I mean, let's move on from just talking about budgets and cost to benefits and value. You should really be seeing those within about 18 months to 2 years, I would say.
Thank you. And Archana, do you agree with that in terms of the payback period?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a long-term investment, right? It's never going to be a quick fix. I think we've all sufficiently hammered that one home. I also agree that project management is critical to getting this right. You cannot just assume that these things will happen by themselves. They need to be thought through from the outset and planned and budgeted for and all of that good stuff. But I think there's one other thing I would add, which is I think there are 3 key levers in this that need quite a lot of thought. And they are people, process, and technology. Which one of those prongs are you solving for? Which one of those prongs are you trying to enhance? And what are you going to do when you reach your goal? So clearly defined targets are important, timelines, ownership, all of the things that are sort of the meat and potatoes behind project management are so important for these projects to work. And then if you do that well, I think you end up reaping the benefits in so many domains. And as Mark said, not just in budget, in efficiency, in flexibility, and in scalability.
Fantastic. And David, is there anything you'd like to add?
I just maybe to echo just a couple of points that have been made. I think one of the things that we see is I think the total cost of ownership is often underestimated, and Archana talks about the project management. I think firms all too often think, oh, right, we're going to do this project and the cost of the project is this. And they don't factor in the cost of change. So all of the other things that this project will touch. And what they often don't factor in is this is not a one-off. Right? So digital is here to stay. We've seen the acceleration of that in the last several months with COVID. And so it's, when you talk about broadening the budget, it's, well, this is a one-off cost to implement the change, but then there are going to be on costs in terms of maintenance, enhancement, and so forth. And so I think it makes it difficult to say, well, when will the payback be on this project? But I would agree with Mark. I think typically some of the projects that we work on, clients should expect and can expect to be making the business case and making good on the investment within a 2-year period. In fact, we've just finished a project where a client, as a result of putting in a new front client-facing solution, will make back in savings half of what they spent on the project in the first year.
Fantastic. I very much hope that is the case. So looking at the time, I'll bring the panel session and therefore the webinar to a close now. So I'd just like to thank each of our panelists for giving up your time today and for providing very detailed responses. Thank you all to each of our guest speakers for very fascinating insights. And thank you all once again to the sponsors for without their support, we wouldn't be able to run these webinars. And finally, thank you all for logging on. So at that point, I will also mention that all the slides will be shared. So please do keep an eye out for those. And in the meantime, very much hope you'll join us at future webinars and have a lovely evening. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.